Thank you very much for coming back to the auditorium, and if you're watching on a screen, then thank you very much for watching. This is my second talk. It's a 45-minute talk on Roman ingenuity and engineering, and I'm very glad they put me on in the afternoon, because if you try saying that in the morning, you can sometimes get quite confused. I'm an engineer by training, not an architect. And engineers are people who tend to find practical solutions to problems. You probably know the story of the three students. There was a mathematician, a physicist, and an engineer, and they were competing for some prize. And the challenge was to find the exact height of a very tall church tower. So the mathematician goes to the top. All they're given is a barometer like this one to measure this height. So the mathematician goes to the top of the tower, lets go the barometer, times until he hears a crash and does his calculation and works out the height of the tower. The physicist thinks, well, that's a bit of a waste of a good barometer, so he measures the atmospheric pressure at the bottom, then he measures the atmospheric pressure at the top, does his calculation, and measures the height that way. The engineer walks round and round the church until he sees a small door marked sacristy. When he knocks on the door, and a man comes in, he says, if you can tell me the exact height of that tower, I'll give you this very nice barometer. So engineers tend to find extremely practical solutions to problems. This is what we're going to cover in the next 40 minutes or so. You'll notice that the word new occurs quite a lot, because we're going to cover quite a lot of innovation that came about during the Roman period of architecture. And then we'll finish with a look at the legacy of the classical period and how it still impacts building design today. Now, last time we looked at the spread of building design from ancient Greece, where it first landed in Europe, you might say. My suggestion to the captain that this is the itinerary we might follow was not that well received. So he said, no, we better stick to the one in the brochure. So we're doing this tour of the Aegean Sea, but at the same time, we're taking this historic tour through architecture from ancient Greek times right up to the present day. And if you want a copy of this timeline, do help yourself. There should be some on the bar at the back. And if you want to download one from my website, you can get one from my website. They're very useful. They're nice card ones, though. I do recommend you take one, because on the back it's completely blank, and you can use it to make a list of something important before you leave. So they're extremely useful, these card timelines. If you think the timeline's too big, then there may be a supply of little bookmarks which are rather smaller. Take a handful of those if you'd rather, or take both if you'd rather. Now, so we're doing these two journeys. One is the journey around the Aegean Sea. The other is this historical journey. And last time we were together, we covered the sort of Greek period. This time we're going to cover the Roman period. Then when we get together for a third time, I'm going to try and cover about 1,000 years of history in 40 minutes, which will be quite a challenge, which is the entire medieval period. And then in the last talk, we'll look at the Renaissance or Renaissance. Now, I've said that these are highly generic terms, and you usually start an argument if you make it this simple. But these are the terms that I use: classical for sort of ancient architecture, medieval for the sort of middle bit, and Renaissance or Renaissance for the last 500 years. They're huge generalizations, and I'm sure someone here will disagree with me. So but it's enough to get us started. And each colored band is a particular style. And last time, we used some Osbert Lancaster cartoons to pick out the main languages of architecture. But very helpfully, the European Central Bank has put the various languages onto the backs of euro notes. So on the 5 euro note, you get these classical motifs. On the 10 euro note, you get the Romanesque, or as it's called in a lot of Europe, the Norman style. Then you get the Gothic style on the 20 euro note. And then on a 50 euro note, you get various Renaissance styles. You might say that that's Palladian. On the 100 euro note, if you're ever rich enough to have one of those, then you get this Baroque or Baroque style. And you probably get even more styles on even more expensive notes, but I've never had one as big as that. So it's quite important for us in Britain at the moment to get Euro notes while we still can, while we're still allowed to, because as you may know, Britain and the European Union have parted company quite recently. But these are just names, and you'll always find somebody who's got a slightly different nomenclature. So if someone looks at that and says, well, no way is that Baroque, then let them have their view. In my view, that what we're looking at there is Baroque or Baroque. So we're through the recap already. Let's get into the meat of today's topic and talk about the various Roman innovations. How did they innovate? Well, from their forerunners, the classical Greek architects, they inherited this wonderful inheritance of proportioned order, stonemasonry, and sculpture in stone. And if you missed the last talk, one of the other things they inherited is this incredible tradition of optical tricks. I'm just going to point out a couple of them, just in case you missed them. Everything is leaning inward slightly. That scaffolding is a perfect vertical, and the whole temple leans in slightly. The gap between columns 1 and 2 is much narrower than the gap between columns 2 and 3, because daylight was often seen between gaps between columns 1 and 2, so if the gap wasn't narrower, it would look wider. And the other thing to note is that most classical temples are built on a convex platform, because if it was absolutely level, it would look as though the thing was sagging slightly in the front. So when you see a classical temple, observe the fact that the stonework that it's built on is ever so slightly convex. Now, the Hellenistic Empire under Alexander the Great stretched right out to the east here and to the south, but the Roman Empire was even larger, and it was expansionist. It went right the way around the Mediterranean, right up into England, almost into Scotland. In fact, it did go into Scotland, and innovative solutions were needed. So Rome inherited and celebrated the classical Greek orders of architecture, the orders that we talked about last time, the Doric order, the Ionic order, and the Corinthian order. And this is surely one of the most iconic structures in ancient Rome, the Colosseum, sometimes called the Flavian Amphitheater. And if you look very carefully, what you can see is the Greek orders of architecture celebrated. There's the Doric order down at the bottom, there's the Ionic order halfway up, and at the top, the Corinthian order. So there was this celebration of the ancient Greek orders of architecture that had been inherited. But these three inherited orders or patterns were modified and added to by the Roman designers. And I'm just going to try and describe slightly how they were modified. This Doric order was modified with the ring across there. You can see a ring across the top. And also they produced a fluteless or grooveless version of the Doric order, which became known as the Tuscan order. When it came to Ionic, they were very keen on this kind of 4-volute version. The Greeks were quite happy with the 2-volute version. Well, actually, that's a 4-volute version, and this is an 8-volute version, but it doesn't matter which side you look at this one, you always see the volutes. And the Romans much preferred that kind of 3-dimensional column. And then they took the Corinthian order down at the bottom here, and they combined it with the Ionic order, and they produced this new order, which has become known as the composite order of architecture. So these orders were modified, the classical Greek orders were modified to produce 5 orders, and all 5 orders have been heavily revived. So this is part of Bernini's piazza around the St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, and there you can see Tuscan order columns is how they're decorated. There's a picture of a composite order capital. I took this picture in that museum that I was talking about last time. It's a museum in Bergama, modern-day Bergama, which is the new name for the old city of Pergamon in western Turkey. And the composite order, which is the most sophisticated, has been imitated again and again. If you've been to Venice, you'll see Palladio's facades. Palladio loved the composite order. If you've been to London, you'll see Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral. He loved the composite order as well. So if you look carefully at the columns on St. Paul's Cathedral, you'll find that some of them are composite order. So from the Roman times, we have these 5 orders or patterns of classical architecture: the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, that were inherited from the ancient Greeks, and then the Tuscan and the composite, which were the new Roman innovations. These 5 orders are celebrated in a building in England, and only a few of us are from England, so I won't test you to see if you know where this is. But on this Tower of the 5 Orders, as it's called, which is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, in England, you can see down at the bottom there the Tuscan, then going up you see Doric, then going up a bit more you see Ionic, then you see Corinthian, and right at the top you see composite. And there, sitting in the middle, is King James, looking very happy with himself because he's just commissioned this brand new translation of the Bible. So we're talking about a building that dates from the early 1600s. The Tower of the 5 Orders in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. We talked a little bit last time about the Roman author Vitruvius. Vitruvius said that architecture needs to be firmitas, utilitas, venustas, durable, useful, beautiful, because if you followed these patterns, these orders, then you would be able to imitate the perfect proportions of nature. So that's what Vitruvius wrote. Vitruvius was a Roman writer and architect, lived just before, in the century before Christ, so about 100 years BC. Now let's move on to structures, and these on the left are the structures that you find in any ancient Greek city site. Note in particular the gymnasium, which is an interesting word, gymnasium, which has come to mean a training place in a lot of European languages. But the Romans added some distinctive new shapes. The first thing they added was the basilica shape. Now we'll see a lot more of the basilica shape as we enter the Christian era, because that's a very good shape for designing an early Christian church. But the basilica shape is actually pre-Christian. And this is a picture of an all-brick built basilica in Trier, which is in modern-day Germany, not far from Frankfurt. And this basilica dates from the 300s, so that's the 4th century AD. But it's essentially a pre-Christian Roman design. The other thing that the Romans did was they modified the theatre design a lot. We talked a little bit last time about the difference between Greek and Roman theatres. And basically, a Roman theatre, what you tend to find is a semicircular performing space here and a very high skene behind the stage. Whereas in a Greek theatre, you find a much larger performing space, often circular, and a very low skene. But it's not a hard and fast rule, and the reason it's not hard and fast is that the Roman architects discovered a lot of ancient Greek theatres and converted them and improved them to make them into Roman theatres. So it's sometimes quite hard to tell whether you're looking at an ancient Greek theatre or an ancient Roman theatre or an ancient Greek theatre that has then been Romanized, such as the great theatre at Epidaurus. Now, a Greek theatre should have room for a complete circle round the bottom there, and it should have a very low skene at the back. But it doesn't always apply. It's not a hard and fast rule. And I said last time that if you're an architectural purist, you don't get confused between theatres and amphitheatres, because an amphitheatre technically goes all the way around. Amphi is the Greek for two or both, And so a theatre that goes all the way round in an oval shape would be called an amphitheater. And here again is the Colosseum in Rome, one of the most famous amphitheaters in the world. So the Romans invented the basilica, they changed the shape of the theatre, they introduced the amphitheater. What else did they introduce? Well, they were quite keen on triumphal columns. This is Trajan's column in Rome. It's not actually Trajan at the top. I think it's probably St. Peter at the top, because Rome became a great center of Christianity after having been a great center of Roman dominance. So you'll find a lot of triumphal columns. And the other thing that they introduced was a lot of bridges and aqueducts. This particular picture is a place called Alcantara in Spain, but there are quite a lot of Alcantaras because it's an Arabic name. It simply means the bridge. So all over Spain you'll find places called Alcantara because they have fine Roman bridges, rather like that one. Here's a picture that my son took of the Roman aqueduct in Segovia in Spain. And here is a picture of the renowned Pont du Gard. This is a Roman aqueduct near Nîmes in France. Let's move on to new motifs, because the Romans also introduced a number of new motifs. This is the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. And a particular motif that it exhibits is this idea of the engaged column. The column is no longer structural, it is decorative. And there you can see the load is being carried by the wall, but the columns are there for decoration rather than for structure. Another innovation was the pilaster, this idea of a square, again decorative column rather than a circular one, was a Roman, well, I wouldn't say it's an innovation, but it was an idea that they popularized. And another useful word is edicule. Just as a molecule is a building block in chemistry, so an edicule is a building block in architecture. And Roman designers thought, well, if I put the thing on a pedestal, two nice columns, and a pediment on top, it looks rather nice, so we'll make that into a motif. And so all over Roman architecture, and again Roman imitation architecture, you find this decorative motif of edicule. Here's a picture I took of Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, just south of England. Osborne House was where Queen Victoria went to when she needed a little bit of retreat from affairs of state, and where she finally died. But there you can see a fine imitation Roman edicule in Osborne House. One other Roman innovation, this idea of the curved pediment. Do you see that pediment at the back of the theatre there is curved? That's a Roman idea. You won't find those in ancient Greek architecture. This is a theatre in Merida in Spain, which dates from about 15 years BC. So we've talked about new orders, new structures, new motifs. The other innovations that the Romans made was the widespread use of brick. And I don't know which tours you were on yesterday, but our guide was very quick to point out that when you can see stone, it's probably from Hellenistic times. But if you see brick, it's almost certainly from Roman times. And indeed, the Romans popularized the use of brick. They weren't the first brick makers by any means, because, of course, we read in the Old Testament about brick making. But they were probably the first in Europe to start making bricks on an industrial scale. Why did they do this? Because the Roman Empire was so large, there simply wasn't enough stone. And in some parts of the empire, there was no stone at all. So they used brick as a building material. And industrial scale brick making even meant that trademarks or brands started to appear on Roman bricks. And as we saw earlier, some buildings were entirely constructed out of brick. Now, there's no need to remember all these different Roman techniques of bricklaying, but they invented lots of different patterned ways of bricklaying. Perhaps just remember one or two of them. The opus reticulatum, which is sort of diamond bricks with retained at the end, and the spicatum method, which looks a bit like a parquet floor. That was a Roman invention. And they also discovered a technique which they called opus cementicum. It's basically concrete. They discovered that if you grind particular types of stone up into a fine dust and mix with water and let it set, it becomes very firm and very stable. And this is a picture of the interior roof of the Pantheon, which is a great circular building in Rome, and it is roofed with this massive concrete dome. The Romans, of course, bequeathed us mosaic as a means of floor and wall decoration. This example is from Fishbourne near Chichester in England, not far from where I live, dating from about the 1st century AD. And they also invented underfloor heating. This is an example in Oxfordshire in England. Basically, it works by lighting a fire by the side of the building, and the hot fumes run under the building and keep the whole building warm. Why? Because in parts of the northern Roman Empire, it got jolly cold and damp, as I well know, during the winter. So having some kind of underfloor heating was well worth having. But perhaps one of the most important Roman bequests to us and to later architects is this idea of the arch. Because before the Romans became to dominate Europe, we didn't really have arches, did we? We basically had posts and lintels. We could have rows of lintels like that, triangular bits to keep the roof, the rain out. And that's why a lot of ancient Greek architecture looks mostly like this. But just a minute, what can you see right down here? There's some archwork right down here. This is the Acropolis in Athens. Athens was a Roman city for quite a long period of its history, and there was quite a lot of Roman innovation in Athens. And here in Athens is the Odeon of Herod Atticus, dating from about 160 AD. And so, with the Romans beginning to dominate Europe, this idea of the arch enters the architectural toolkit. Typically built over a wooden frame, which can then be removed to leave a freestanding and highly stable structure. But if you have an engineering background, you may recognize this diagram as a force diagram. Gravitational forces in arches present certain challenges. And if you built an arch with very thin columns like that and just left it, the columns would probably fall outwards because of the lateral force, and the arch would fall down on someone's head. And that's not good when that happens for an architect, when something falls on someone's head. So, one way of solving that problem is to build solid walls on either side to prevent the sides of the arches falling outwards, which could be why early archwork often looks like this. You put very solid masonry either side of the arch. Another solution is to put lintels like that either side of the arch. And that looks rather nice, doesn't it? And that could be why so many Roman edifices have this sort of motif, a circular arch and a lintel on either side. This is a building that you might see tomorrow if you visit ancient Ephesus. It's the Temple of Hadrian on Curates Street. In Roman times, emperors were sort of godlike. So if you knew that an emperor was coming to visit, and indeed Hadrian did come and visit Ephesus, then you made sure that there was a temple dedicated to that particular emperor. So this is the Temple of Hadrian on Quirites Street in Ephesus. And this motif has been imitated again and again. Here's a Serlian, it's called a Serlian arch. There was an architect called Sebastiano Serlio. He had nothing to do with that nomenclature. I have no idea why it's called a Serlian arch, but it is. And that motif is used again and again. Here we are now in the 18th century, just outside London. This is Chiswick House, just outside London. And there you can see a Serlian arch. And another London architect who is quite well celebrated is Nicholas Hawksmoor, another 18th century architect, and he loved this motif of the Serlian arch, the arch with a lintel on either side, and this is his church of Christ Church in Spitalfields, just outside the centre of London. He was very fortunate to win a government commission to build quite a lot of churches around the outskirts of what was then London, because there weren't considered to be enough churches around London, so the government commissioned a whole lot more, and Hawksmoor got the commission. The next thought is, if we put two lintels like that, why don't we arch those little gaps as well? And then you get a very stable structure capable of supporting a huge amount of masonry, which might be why so many triumphal arches basically look like this. Now that's an engineer's view. I've heard all sorts of stories about, the main person goes through the middle and the outriders go through the outer arches, but actually from an engineering point of view, that is an incredibly stable structure. And it's been imitated again and again. That's the famous Arch of Constantine in Rome. But here is the Arc de Triomphe de Carrousel in Paris, a 19th century edifice. And this is the Marble Arch in London. This used to be the grand processional entrance to Buckingham Palace, but designed by an architect called John Nash. But it got moved at the time of the Great Exhibition in London. This is 1851. It got moved to the middle of a roundabout, so now you can see there are buses going all the way around it. It's quite hard to get to without getting run over. But that is the Marble Arch in London, and there you can see a classic revival triumphal arch. Another technique is to put arches in a row, rather like this. And that's probably the reason that so many fine Roman structures, such as the Pont du Gard near Nîmes, have quite thin pillars, because the arches are all in a row, and therefore the lateral force is well absorbed. When you were in Athens, you might have seen this, the Arch of Hadrian, the same old Hadrian, he got everywhere. And you can't help thinking, when you look at this, that the Romans are cocking a snoop at the ancient Greek architects and saying, well, actually an arch spans a much wider gap than a post and lintel ever did. Roman thinking went on to say, well, if we can do arches, couldn't we also do vaults along tunnels? And about 10 years ago, my wife and I were lucky enough to visit a place called Ezanoi, which is in Anatolia, or in western Turkey. And there, on a hilltop, we found this magnificent temple. And as we got closer to it, we realized we were looking, obviously, at an Ionic order temple, but we couldn't immediately work out whether it was from the Hellenistic period or for the Roman period, until we went downstairs and we found the whole thing was built on this huge vault. And there, to give you a sense of scale, you can see my wife and her sister at the bottom. This is an enormous vault on which the temple is built. And we're talking about earthquake-prone country. So vaults are very good at resisting shaking ground. And I was on a cruise quite recently with a geologist, and he was talking about a volcanic eruption somewhere in the West Indies. And the only survivor of this was a prisoner who had been imprisoned in a vaulted cell. And the vaulted cell was completely undamaged in the eruption, and everything else was destroyed. So vaults are extremely stable. And if you if you walk around Aizanoi, you come across this great Roman stadium. The superstructure, the bit above ground level, has almost all disappeared because the earthquakes have shaken it so much. But it was built upon vaults, and you can see that the vaults are still largely intact. There's the Roman theatre. You can tell it's Roman because of this high scene behind. Again, a lot of it collapsed in the earthquakes. And there, in the middle of the village, is the town bridge, ancient Roman arches, modern-day Turkish opus cementicum lying on top of it, but essentially solid Roman arches that have survived for the best part of 2,000 years. And the lovely thing about going around that part of the world, I don't know if it's still true, they've probably cleared it up now, but you could go into the river, and there you find amongst the rubbish, can you see an old tractor tire there? And then amongst the rubbish you find bits of dressed Roman stone just tossed into the river like any old rubbish, an archaeologist's dream. So the next bit of Roman thinking was, well, if we have vaults, couldn't we also have a complete arch that goes in 360 degrees, a dome? So we're now going to watch a short video which introduces the idea of the dome. Here we go.
The dome did not come to the Romans by chance. It emerged out of a form they used for bridges, buildings, and aqueducts: the arch. Roman builders realized that if they rotated the arch in a circle, it would become this symmetrical, strong, three-dimensional shape, a dome, which was first used for such everyday buildings as baths. But even such small structures reveal the virtue of the form. Domes create totally open interior spaces. The Pantheon was designed for Roman Emperor Hadrian to accommodate vast crowds, but its size reveals the fundamental engineering problems of all domes. Throughout the dome or curved roof of the Pantheon, the masonry pushes inward and upward on the masonry above it. This inward and upward force of the lower masonry, combined with the downward force due to gravity of the upper masonry, creates compression and makes the dome stable. At the top, it is even possible to make a hole or oculus because compression in the rim makes it strong and stable. But the masonry used to construct the dome is very heavy. The enormous weight of the dome caused a stretching called tension, which expanded the base of the dome, and cracks began to appear. To save their dome from collapse, Hadrian's builders added enormous layers of concrete called step rings that push against the dome and provide the inward force the dome needs to prevent the expansion. The Pantheon's thick walls now can push almost straight up, supporting the weight of the heavy step rings and the rest of the dome. Hadrian's engineers also had to find ways to lighten their dome, and their solutions are a classic case of engineering skill producing great art. The oculus, that opening at the top of the dome, eliminates some mass while creating the daily light show for which the Pantheon is famous. These intricate shapes, called coffers, also eliminate some masonry, and the Romans used low-density concrete near the top of the dome to reduce the weight even further. The result was an almost impossibly huge dome, one that would remain the world's largest for 1,500 years.
So this vast space of the Pantheon is covered by this enormous dome, which even today is still one of the largest in the world. It's not the largest, but it's still a very large dome. There is an external picture of it, and the area at the top here is completely open. So if it's pouring with rain and you're standing in the middle of the Pantheon, you will get wet. But if it's only lightly raining, then there's enough warm air to evaporate the downward water, so the interior stays dry. It's an extraordinary achievement. Here's another internal view of the dome made of concrete, showing these coffers which are there to reduce the weight, and the oculus at the top there also reduces the weight. Now, last time we were together, we talked a little bit about the golden rectangle, and the golden rectangle keeps on popping up in Roman buildings too, and the jury is still out as to whether this is an intention or an accidental aesthetic. But no one's quite sure why the Pantheon has that second pediment above the porch there. But, believe it or not, that shape is an exact golden rectangle. So it could be that the architects thought, well, we better have a nice looking rectangle in here somewhere, so that's why they put it in. So we've covered a lot of topics, and the last topic that I just want to hit upon is the legacy that has been left to us by the Roman era of architecture. And it's a huge legacy. So many of our buildings today and for the last few hundred years have been influenced by what the Romans left us. Here is the magnificent Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. I'm sure a number of you have been there, and it is a classic Roman triumphal gate. And there you can see it's in the Doric order, and if you look carefully, you can see what we discussed the other day, which is the slabs on tops of the columns and the little guttae above, just below each triglyph. This is not far from me. This is the Corn Exchange in Chichester, in Sussex, in England. And there, again, the neoclassical design is based on a Roman temple. There you can see Doric order again with the slabs and the guttae. I hope that the city engineer of Chichester is not in the auditorium, because I'm going to be slightly rude about the fact that a street lamp was allowed to be affixed just there, which I think is a terrible mistake because it completely destroys the symmetry of the thing. But anyway, that's just my opinion. It might be very useful. I think it's particularly useful at midnight if you're walking down that street. Here we are in Harrogate in Yorkshire in England. Harrogate is an ancient Roman city, and this is a 21st century shopping centre, but you can see it's covered in Roman motifs again. You can see Serlian arches, you can see statues of the great and the good on tops of plinths right at the top there, and when they've got more great and good people in Harrogate, I'm sure they'll fill up all the plinths. But it is essentially a Roman-inspired building. And Harrogate is a great exhibition city. There's one of the exhibition halls. Can you see that a modern architect has incorporated classical motifs again into that particular design? So we've covered, I think, all the topics that I really wanted to get through today, but don't forget that the most important thing, possibly, that the Roman era did for architecture was the introduction of the arch. So where you see arches, it's probably from a Roman era. That's all I'm going to say today, but do come back next time if you're able to, and we'll talk about the medieval period of architecture and talk a little bit about Byzantine, Romanesque, and Gothic. But until then, thank you very much.